Section 33 of Within a Budding Grove by Marcel Proust. Translated by C.K. Scott Moncrief. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kristen Hand. Place Names the Place, Part 14. As a matter of fact, Saint-Loup was absolutely sincere and disinterested, and it was this intense moral purity which, not being able to find entire satisfaction in a selfish sentiment such as love, nor, on the other hand, meeting in him the impossibility, which existed in me, for instance, of finding its spiritual nourishment elsewhere than in himself, rendered him truly capable, just as I was incapable, of friendship. Francois was no less mistaken about Saint-Loup when she complained that he had the sort of air as if he did not look down upon the people, but that it was all just a pretense, and you had only to see him when he was in a temper with his groom. It had indeed sometimes happened that Robert would scold his groom with a certain amount of brutality, which proved that he had the sense, not so much of the difference as of the equality between classes and masses. "But," he said, in answer to my rebuke of having treated the man rather harshly, "why should I go out of my way to speak politely to him? Isn't he my equal? Isn't he just as near to me as any of my uncles and cousins? You seem to think that I ought to treat him with respect, as an inferior. You talk like an aristocrat," he added scornfully. And indeed, if there was a class to which he showed himself prejudiced and hostile, it was the aristocracy. So much so that he found it as hard to believe in the superior qualities of a man in society as he found it easy to believe in those of a man of the people. When I mentioned the Princess de Luxembourg, whom I had met with his aunt, "An old trout," was his comment, "like all that lot. She's a sort of cousin of mine, by the way." Having a strong prejudice against the people who frequented it, he rarely went into society, and the contemptuous or hostile attitude which he adopted towards it served to increase, among all his near relatives, the painful impression made by his intimacy with a woman on the stage, a connection which, they declared, would be his ruin, blaming it specially for having bred in him that spirit of denigration, that bad spirit, and for having led him astray, after which it was only a matter of time before he would have dropped out altogether. And so, many easy-going men of the Faubourg Saint-Germain were without compunction when they spoke of Robert's mistress. "Those girls do their job," they would say. "They are as good as anybody else. But that one? No, thank you. We cannot forgive her. She has done too much harm to a fellow we were fond of." Of course, he was not the first to be caught in that snare, but the others amused themselves like men of the world, continued to think like men of the world about politics, about everything. As for him, his family found him soured. They did not bear in mind that for many young men of fashion who would otherwise remain uncultivated mentally, rough in their friendships, without gentleness or taste, it is very often their mistress who is their real master, and connections of this sort the only school of morals in which they are initiated into a superior culture, and learn the value of disinterested relations. Even among the lower orders, who, when it comes to coarseness, so often remind us of the world of fashion, the woman, more sensitive, finer, more leisured, is driven by curiosity to adopt certain refinements, respects certain beauties of sentiment and of art, which, though she may fail to understand them, she nevertheless places above what has seemed most desirable to the man, above money or position. Now, whether the mistress be a young blood's, such as Saint-Loup, or a young workman's, electricians, for instance, must now be included in our truest order of chivalry, her lover has too much admiration and respect for her not to extend them also to what she herself respects and admires, and for him the scale of values is thereby reversed. Her sex alone makes her weak. She suffers from nervous troubles, inexplicable things which in a man, or even in another woman, a woman whose nephew or cousin he was, would bring a smile to the lips of this stalwart young man. But he cannot bear to see her suffer whom he loves. The young nobleman, who, like Saint-Loup, has a mistress, acquires the habit, when he takes her out to dine, of carrying in his pocket the valerian drops which she may need, of ordering the waiter, firmly and with no hint of sarcasm, to see that he shuts the doors quietly, and not to put any damp moss on the table, so as to spare his companion those discomforts which himself he has never felt, which compose for him an occult world in whose reality she has taught him to believe, discomfort for which he now feels pity without in the least needing to understand them, for which he will still feel pity when other women than she shall be the sufferers. St. Lup's mistress, as the first monks of the Middle Ages taught Christendom, had taught him to be kind to animals, for which she had a passion, never moving without her dog, her canaries, her love-birds. St. Lup looked after them with motherly devotion, and treated as brutes the people who were not good to dumb creatures. On the other hand, an actress, or so-called actress, like this one who was living with him, whether she were intelligent or not, and as to that I had no knowledge, by making him find the society of fashionable women boring, and look upon having to go out to a party as a painful duty, had saved him from snobbishness and cured him of frivolity. If, thanks to her, his social engagements filled a smaller place in the life of her young lover, at the same time, whereas, if he had been simply a drawing-room man, vanity or self-interest would have dictated his choice of friends as rudeness would have characterized his treatment of them, his mistress had taught him to bring nobility and refinement into his friendship. With her feminine instinct, with a keener appreciation in men of certain qualities of sensibility which her lover might perhaps, without her guidance, have misunderstood and laughed at them, she had always been swift to distinguish from among the rest of St. Lup's friends the one who had a real affection for him, and to make that one her favorite. She knew how to make him feel grateful to such a friend, show his gratitude, notice what things gave his friend pleasure and what pain. And presently St. Lup, without any more need of her to prompt him, began to think of all these things by himself. And at Balbec, where she was not with him, for me, whom she had never seen, whom he had perhaps not yet so much as mentioned in his letters to her, of his own accord would pull up the window of a carriage in which I was sitting, take out of the room the flowers that made me feel unwell, and when he had to say goodbye to several people at once, managed to do so before it was actually time for him to go, so as to be left alone and last with me, to make that distinction between them and me, to treat me differently from the rest. His mistress had opened his mind to the invisible, had brought a serious element into his life, delicacy into his heart, but all this escaped his sorrowing family, who repeated, "That creature will be the death of him. Meanwhile, she's doing what she can to disgrace him." It is true that he had succeeded in getting out of her all the good that she was capable of doing him, and that she now caused him only incessant suffering, for she had taken an intense dislike to him and tormented him in every possible way. She had begun, one fine day, to look upon him as stupid and absurd, because the friends that she had among the younger writers and actors had assured her that he was, and she duly repeated what they had said with that passion, the want of reserve which we show whenever we receive from without and adopt as our own opinions or customs of which we previously knew nothing. She readily professed, like her actor friends, that between St. Lup and herself there was a great gulf fixed, and not to be crossed, because they were of different races, because she was an intellectual, and he, whatever he might pretend, the born enemy of the intellect. This view of him seemed to her profound, and she sought confirmation of it in the most insignificant words, the most trivial actions of her lover. But when the same friends had further convinced her that she was destroying, in company so ill-suited to her, the great hopes which she had, they said, aroused in them, that her lover would leave a mark on her, that by living with him she was spoiling her future as an artist, to her contempt for St. Lup was added the same hatred that she would have felt for him if he had insisted upon inoculating her with a deadly germ. She saw him as seldom as possible, at the same time postponing the hour of a definite rupture, which seemed to me a highly improbable event. St. Lup made such sacrifices for her that unless she was ravishingly beautiful, but he had always refused to show me her photograph, saying, "For one thing, she's not a beauty, and besides, she always takes badly. These are only some snapshots that I took myself with my Kodak. They would give you a wrong idea of her." it would surely be difficult for her to find another man who would consent to anything of the sort. I never reflected that a certain obsession to make a name for oneself, even when one has no talent, that the admiration, no more than the privately expressed admiration of people who are imposing on one, can, although it may not perhaps have been the case with San Loup's mistress, be, even for a little prostitute, motives more determining than the pleasure of making money. San Loup, who without quite understanding what was going on in the mind of his mistress, did not believe her to be completely sincere either in her unfair reproaches or in her promises of undying love, had all the same at certain moments the feeling that she would break with him whenever she could, and accordingly, impelled no doubt by the instinct of self-preservation which was part of his love, a love more clear-sighted possibly than San Loup himself, making use, too, of a practical capacity for business which was compatible in him with the loftiest and blindest flights of the heart, had refused to settle upon her any capital, had borrowed an enormous sum so that she should want nothing, but made it over to her only from day to day. And no doubt, assuming that she really thought of leaving him, she was calmly waiting until she had feathered her nest, a process which, with the money given her by San Loup, would not perhaps take very long, but would all the same require a time which must be conceded to prolong the happiness of my new friend, or his misery. This dramatic period of their connection, which had now reached its most acute stage, the most cruel for San Loup, for she had forbidden him to remain in Paris, where his presence exasperated her, and had forced him to spend his leave at Balbec, within easy reach of his regiment, had begun one evening at the house of one of San Loup's aunts, on whom he had prevailed to allow his friend to come there, before a large party, to recite some of the speeches from a symbolical play in which she had once appeared in an advanced theatre, and for which she had made him share the admiration that she herself professed. But when she appeared in the room with a large lily in her hand, and wearing a costume copied from the Ancilla Domini, which she had persuaded San Loup was an absolute vision of beauty, her entrance had been greeted, in that assemblage of club men and duchesses, with smiles which the monotonous tone of her chantings, the oddity of certain words and their frequent recurrence, had changed into fits of laughter, stifled at first, but presently so uncontrollable that the wretched reciter had been unable to go on. Next day, San Loup's aunt had been universally censured for having allowed so grotesque an actress to appear in her drawing-room. A well-known duke made no bones about telling her that she had only herself to blame if she found herself criticized. Damn it all, people really don't come to see turns like that. If the woman had talent even, but she has none and never will have any. 'Pon my soul, Paris is not such a fool as people make out. Society does not consist exclusively of imbeciles. This little lady evidently believed that she was going to take Paris by surprise. But Paris is not so easily surprised as all that, and there are still some things that they can't make us swallow. As for the actress, she left the house with San Loup, exclaiming, "What do you mean by letting me in for those geese, those uneducated bitches, those dirty corner boys? I don't mind telling you there wasn't a man in the room who didn't make eyes at me or squeeze my foot, and it was because I wouldn't look at them that they were out for revenge." Words which had changed Robert's antipathy for people in society into a horror that was at once deep and distressing, and was provoked in him most of all by those who least deserved it, devoted kinsmen who, on behalf of the family, had sought to persuade San Loup's lady to break with him, a move which she represented to him as inspired by their passion for her. Robert, although he had at once ceased to see them, used to imagine when he was parted from his mistress as he was now, that they or others like them were profiting by his absence to return to the charge that had possibly prevailed over her. And when he spoke of the sensualists who were disloyal to their friends, who sought to seduce their friends' wives, tried to make them come to houses of assignation, his whole face would glow with suffering and hatred. "I would kill them with less compunction than I would kill a dog, which is at least a well-behaved beast, and loyal and faithful. There are men who deserve the guillotine, if you like, far more than poor wretches who have been led into crime by poverty and by the cruelty of the rich." He spends the greater part of his time in sending letters and telegrams to his mistress. Every time that, while still preventing him from returning to Paris, she found an excuse to quarrel with him by post, I read the news at once in his evident discomposure. inasmuch as his mistress never told him what fault she found with him, suspecting that possibly if she did not tell him it was because she did not know herself, and simply had had enough of him. He would still have liked an explanation, and used to write to her, "Tell me what I have done wrong. I am quite ready to acknowledge my faults," the grief that overpowered him having the effect of persuading him that he had behaved badly. But she kept him waiting indefinitely for her answers, which when they did come were meaningless. And so it was, almost always with a furrowed brow and often with empty hands, that I would see Saint Loup returning from the post office, where alone in all the hotel, he and Francois went to fetch or to hand in letters, he from a lover's impatience, she with a servant's mistrust of others. His telegrams obliged him to take a much longer journey. When, some days after our dinner with the Blochs, my grandmother told me with a joyful air that Saint Loup had just been asking her whether before he left Balbec she would not like him to take a photograph of her, and when I saw that she had put on her nicest dress on purpose and was hesitating between several of her best hats, I felt a little annoyed by this childishness, which surprised me coming from her. I even went the length of asking myself whether I had not been mistaken in my grandmother, whether I did not esteem her too highly, whether she was as unconcerned as I had always supposed in the adornment of her person, whether she had not indeed the very weakness that I believed most alien to her temperament, namely coquetry. Unfortunately, this displeasure that I derived from the prospect of a photographic sitting, and more particularly from the satisfaction with which my grandmother appeared to be looking forward to it, I made so apparent that Francois remarked it and did her best, unintentionally, to increase it by making me a sentimental, gushing speech by which I refused to appear unmoved. "Oh, master, my poor madame will be so pleased at having her likeness taken. She is going to wear the hat that her old Francois has trimmed for her. You must allow her, master." I acquired the conviction that I was not cruel in laughing at Francois's sensibility, by reminding myself that my mother and grandmother, my models in all things, often did the same. But my grandmother, noticing that I seemed cross, said that if this plan of her sitting for her photograph offended me in any way she would give it up. I would not let her. I assured her that I saw no harm in it, and left her to adorn herself. But thinking that I showed my penetration and strength of mind, I added a few stinging words of sarcasm, intended to neutralize the pleasure which she seemed to find in being photographed, so that if I was obliged to see my grandmother's magnificent hat, I succeeded at least in driving from her face that joyful expression which ought to have made me glad. But alas, it too often happens, while the people we love best are still alive, that such expressions appear to us as the exasperating manifestation of some unworthy freak of fancy, rather than as the precious form of the happiness which we should dearly like to procure for them. My ill humor arose more particularly from the fact that, during the last week, my grandmother had appeared to be avoiding me, and I had not been able to have her to myself for a moment, either by night or day. When I came back in the afternoon to be alone with her for a little, I was told that she was not in the hotel, or else she would shut herself up with Francois for endless confabulations which I was not permitted to interrupt. And when, after being out all evening with Saint Loup, I had been thinking on the way home of the moment at which I should be able to go to my grandmother and to kiss her, in vain might I wait for her to knock on the partition between us the 3 little taps which would tell me to go in and say good night to her. I heard nothing. At length I would go to bed, a little resentful of her for depriving me, with an indifference so new and strange in her, of a joy on which I had so much counted. I would lie still for a while, my heart throbbing as in my childhood, listening to the wall which remained silent, until I cried myself to sleep. End of section 33.